Late October 1943. A nondescript office building in the Bendler Block, Berlin. Major Klaus Weber sat at his desk, studying a peculiar document that had arrived from the testing facility at Kummersdorf 3 days earlier. The report was typed on standard Wehrmacht technical paper, filled with the usual columns of measurements and performance data that logistics officers reviewed daily. Nothing about its appearance suggested it contained information that would fundamentally alter Weber's understanding of armoured warfare. Weber commanded the logistics planning section for Panzer operations, a position that made him responsible for calculating fuel requirements, maintenance schedules, and operational ranges for Germany's armoured divisions. He was 38 years old, a career officer who had entered military service in 1928, risen through the ranks based on demonstrated competence in the unglamorous but essential work of keeping armies supplied and mobile. The document before him detailed automotive trials of a captured American M4 Sherman tank, serial number USA 3067641, designated by German testers as Panzer IV. The Sherman had been driven across varied terrain under controlled conditions, while engineers measured fuel consumption, monitored mechanical systems, and recorded performance data with Prussian precision. Weber had reviewed hundreds of similar technical reports during his career. Tank testing was routine. Captured equipment was always examined thoroughly. This report should have been unremarkable, just another data point in the endless stream of intelligence about enemy capabilities. But one number in the fuel consumption section made Weber stop and reread the entire page 3 times, convinced there must be an error in the documentation. The captured Sherman had completed a 200-kilometer cross-country trial, consuming 195 litres of gasoline. Weber performed the calculation automatically. 195 litres for 200 kilometres meant fuel consumption of approximately 0.975 litres per kilometre. The tank's fuel capacity was listed as 625 litres, standard for the Sherman with its 2 internal tanks. Simple arithmetic produced a figure that seemed impossible. If the Sherman consumed 1 litre per kilometre under field conditions and carried 625 litres of fuel, then its operational range exceeded 600 kilometres on a single tank of gasoline. 600 kilometres. Weber stared at the number, searching for the error that must exist somewhere in the calculation. German Panzer IV medium tanks, comparable in weight and roll to the Sherman, had operational ranges of approximately 200 kilometres under favourable conditions. The Panther, Germany's newest medium tank with its powerful 700 horsepower Maybach engine, achieved perhaps 250 kilometres of range if the crew drove carefully and avoided unnecessary manoeuvring. Tiger heavy tanks, massively armoured and carrying enormous fuel capacity in their 820-litre tanks, managed perhaps 120 kilometres of operational movement before requiring refueling. The idea that an American tank could travel 600 kilometres on internal fuel contradicted everything Weber understood about armoured vehicle logistics. Long operational range required either enormous fuel tanks that added weight and reduced internal space for crew and ammunition, or extremely fuel-efficient engines that sacrificed power for economy. The Sherman had neither. Its fuel tanks were unremarkably sized. Its engine produced adequate power for combat operations. Yet somehow, it consumed less than half the fuel per kilometre that German tanks required. Weber checked the report's authentication codes and signatures. The testing had been conducted at Kummersdorf, Germany's primary proving ground for armour evaluation. The engineers who conducted the trials were experienced professionals whose competence was beyond question. The document bore the proper stamps and clearances, indicating it had passed through appropriate review channels. This was not a field report from combat units who might exaggerate enemy capabilities. This was systematic testing under controlled conditions by technical specialists, trained to measure accurately and report objectively. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He pulled additional files from his cabinet, extracting operational reports from panzer divisions that had fought in North Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front. These field reports documented real-world fuel consumption rates under combat conditions. Panzer IV tanks operating in Tunisia consumed approximately 2 liters per kilometer during tactical movements. Panthers on the Eastern Front required careful fuel management to avoid running dry after barely 100 kilometers of combat operations. The disparity was not marginal, it was fundamental. If the Sherman truly achieved twice the operational range of German medium tanks, the implications for armoured warfare extended far beyond simple logistics calculations. Operational range determined how far tanks could advance without requiring vulnerable supply convoys to follow. It affected tactical flexibility, strategic mobility, the ability to exploit breakthroughs or conduct rapid pursuit operations. Weber began calculating what 600-kilometer operational range meant in practical terms. A panzer division advancing across open terrain in Russia or France could move perhaps 150 kilometers before its fuel situation became critical and required halting for resupply. The division would establish defensive positions while supply convoys fought through traffic congestion to deliver fuel trucks from rear area depots. The process took hours at minimum, often days if enemy air attacks disrupted supply routes or if fuel stocks were limited at source depots. An American armored division with Sherman tanks could advance 400 kilometers before facing similar constraints. The Americans could drive straight through German defensive positions, penetrate deep into rear areas, and continue operations, while German forces were still waiting for fuel trucks to arrive. The advantage was not just quantitative but qualitative. It fundamentally changed the operational tempo of armoured warfare. Weber requested additional technical reports from Kummersdorf, specifically asking for detailed engine and transmission analysis that might explain the Sherman's fuel efficiency. The reports arrived 2 weeks later in a thick folder containing photographs, technical drawings, and exhaustive engineering assessments that German specialists had compiled over months of testing. The Continental R975 radial engine in this particular Sherman variant was not remarkable in design or concept. It was an air-cooled 9-cylinder radial producing approximately 350 horsepower, adapted from an aircraft engine design used in training planes. German engineers noted that the engine was relatively simple, employed conventional technology, included no exotic materials or revolutionary innovations. It was, in their assessment, a competent but unexceptional power plant of the type any industrialized nation could design and build. What impressed German analysts was not the engine's sophistication, but its systematic optimization for fuel economy without sacrificing combat performance. The engine operated at relatively low compression ratios compared to high-performance German engines, reducing fuel consumption at the cost of maximum power output. The carburation system was tuned for efficiency rather than peak performance, delivering fuel-air mixtures optimized for economy during sustained cruising. The cooling system maintained consistent operating temperatures that kept the engine in its most efficient operating range. Every design choice prioritized reliability and economy over theoretical maximum capability. The result was an engine that produced adequate power for combat requirements while consuming substantially less fuel than German equivalents that generated higher peak horsepower but operated less efficiently. The transmission analysis proved equally revealing. The Sherman employed a 5-speed manual transmission with synchromesh in gears 2 through 5, making gear changes smooth and reducing power losses during shifting. The gear ratios were carefully selected to keep the engine operating in its most efficient power band during normal movement. The final drive ratio provided good balance between top speed and fuel economy. German tanks typically employed transmissions designed to extract maximum performance from their engines, accepting higher fuel consumption as the price of superior acceleration and top speed. The Sherman transmission prioritized efficiency, giving up some performance to achieve better fuel economy. For sustained operational movements across long distances, efficiency mattered more than maximum performance. But the real revelation came in the powertrain integration analysis. German engineers noted that the Sherman's engine, transmission, and final drives worked together as an optimized system rather than individual components meeting specified performance requirements. The engine's torque curve matched the transmission's gear ratios. The transmission's output characteristics suited the final drive requirements. The entire drivetrain was designed to minimize power losses and maximize efficiency at typical combat operating speeds. This systematic approach to powertrain engineering reflected decades of American automotive industry experience that Germany had never developed at comparable scale. American automobile manufacturers had spent years optimizing engines and transmissions for fuel economy because civilian consumers demanded economical vehicles. When these same companies designed tanks, they applied hard-won knowledge about efficient powertrain integration that German tank designers, working primarily from theoretical principles, had never acquired through practical commercial experience. Weber studied these technical reports with growing unease. The Sherman's fuel efficiency was not accidental or the result of some clever trick. It was fundamental to the vehicle's design philosophy. American engineers had deliberately prioritized operational range and fuel economy as primary requirements, accepting some compromises in maximum performance to achieve superior logistics sustainability. German tanks prioritized combat performance specifications: armor thickness, gun power, top speed, acceleration. Fuel economy was a secondary consideration, something to be managed through careful planning and disciplined driving rather than optimized through design. The Americans had recognized that fuel efficiency directly determined operational effectiveness and designed accordingly. The implications extended beyond individual tank capabilities to fundamental questions about armored doctrine and strategic mobility. Weber began analyzing operational reports from recent campaigns, looking for patterns that fuel efficiency differences might explain. In North Africa, during 1942 and 1943, German Panzer divisions conducted brilliant tactical maneuvers that consistently defeated larger Allied forces through superior positioning and timing. But German advances repeatedly stalled not because of enemy resistance, but because fuel supplies ran out. Rommel's forces spent as much time waiting for fuel trucks as they spent fighting, watching opportunities disappear while supply convoys struggled forward through inadequate road networks. American forces, by contrast, maintained offensive operations with remarkable persistence once they accumulated sufficient strength. Units that suffered tactical defeats were quickly reinforced and supplied, resuming attacks within days. The pattern was consistent. German tactical victories produced limited strategic gains. American tactical setbacks barely slowed operational momentum. Weber had attributed this pattern to American numerical superiority and their overwhelming logistics infrastructure. Dozens of supply ships delivering thousands of tons daily, vast supply dumps containing more material than entire German armies possessed, fleets of trucks moving supplies forward continuously. These advantages were real and significant, but the Sherman's fuel efficiency added another dimension to American logistics superiority that Weber had not previously recognized. If American tanks could travel twice as far on a tank of fuel, then every gallon of gasoline delivered to the front lines produced twice as much operational movement. American logistics capacity was not just larger than German capacity, it was more efficient, extracting more military utility from each ton of supplies delivered forward. December 1943 brought additional reports from the Eastern Front that reinforced Weber's concerns about German logistics disadvantages. Panzer divisions operating in Ukraine and Belarus reported chronic fuel shortages that limited their ability to respond to Soviet offensives. Units received explicit orders to minimize unnecessary movement, conserving fuel for actual combat operations. Tanks sat immobilized in defensive positions not because they were awaiting repairs, but because moving them consumed precious fuel that might be needed for counterattacks or withdrawals. These restrictions fundamentally compromised armored warfare principles. Tanks achieved maximum effectiveness through mobility, using speed and maneuver to achieve positional advantages and avoid enemy strengths. Static tanks became merely mobile artillery, firing from fixed positions, unable to exploit opportunities or avoid threats. The panzer divisions that had conquered Poland and France through rapid movement were being reduced to pillboxes on tracks, hobbled by fuel constraints that made their mobility theoretical rather than practical. Weber compared these operational restrictions to intelligence reports about American armored operations in Italy. American tank battalions moved constantly, repositioning between sectors, concentrating for attacks, dispersing to avoid counterattacks, conducting reconnaissance movements, shifting to exploit opportunities. The operational tempo was exhausting for crews, but devastatingly effective at keeping German forces off balance and unable to establish stable defensive positions. The Americans could afford this operational intensity because their tanks consumed less fuel per kilometer and their logistics system delivered fuel in abundance. German forces had to carefully ration movement, calculating whether each tactical repositioning justified the fuel expenditure, watching fuel gauges as closely as they watched for enemy movement. By January 1944, Weber had compiled enough evidence to prepare a comprehensive assessment for the General Staff Logistics Directorate. The report was methodical and carefully documented, presenting captured technical data, field observations, and calculated projections of operational implications. Weber avoided alarmist language, letting the mathematics speak for themselves. The core finding was straightforward. American Sherman tanks achieved operational ranges 2 to 3 times greater than comparable German medium tanks through systematic design optimization for fuel efficiency. This advantage compounded American logistics superiority, making their numerical advantages even more operationally decisive. German Panzer divisions, operating with limited fuel supplies, faced American armored divisions that could maintain offensive operations continuously without the frequent operational pauses that German forces required for refueling. The report included specific recommendations. German tank designers should prioritize fuel efficiency in future designs, accepting some compromises in maximum performance to achieve better operational range. Logistics planning should account for the greater operational flexibility that fuel-efficient vehicles provided enemy forces. Tactical doctrine should acknowledge that American tanks could exploit breakthroughs more effectively through superior range, requiring German forces to maintain deeper reserves and respond more quickly to American penetrations. Weber submitted the report through appropriate channels and waited for response. Days passed without acknowledgement. Weeks went by with no indication the report had even been read. Weber made inquiries, discovering that his assessment had been filed without significant distribution. The response from one senior logistics officer was dismissive. American fuel efficiency was irrelevant because American forces already had overwhelming fuel supplies. Whether their tanks consumed more or less fuel made no practical difference when they had unlimited gasoline available. This response missed the fundamental point Weber had tried to make. The Sherman's efficiency advantage mattered precisely because it multiplied the effectiveness of American logistics capacity. Every supply convoy delivered more operational utility. Every forward fuel dump enabled longer advances. The combination of abundant supplies and efficient consumption created capabilities that neither factor alone would produce. But Weber's arguments found no audience among officers focused on immediate operational crises. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. Allied bombing campaigns were intensifying over Germany. The Italian front was consuming scarce resources. Fuel shortages affected all German military operations, not just armored divisions. In this context of immediate crisis, long-term questions about tank design philosophy seemed academic and irrelevant. Weber continued his analysis privately, accumulating additional evidence as new intelligence reached Berlin. Reports from Normandy after the Allied invasion in June 1944 described American armored operations that confirmed every pattern Weber had identified from earlier campaigns. American tank divisions advanced rapidly once they broke through initial German defenses, penetrating dozens of kilometers in single days, maintaining offensive pressure that gave German forces no opportunity to establish stable defensive lines. German Panzer divisions attempting counterattacks found themselves fuel-starved and unable to sustain operations. The 5th Panzer Army attacking American forces during Operation Lüttich in August 1944 achieved initial surprise and made promising gains before running completely out of fuel within 2 days. The operation failed not because of tactical errors or enemy resistance, but because German logistics could not supply enough gasoline to sustain even a modest offensive lasting 48 hours. American forces suffered heavy losses during the initial German attack, but recovered within days, bringing forward reinforcements and supplies that overwhelmed the stalled German assault. The pattern was utterly utterly predictable. German tactical skill produced initial successes. Logistics constraints halted German advances. American material superiority ground down German forces through attrition. Fuel efficiency multiplied American advantages, while German fuel shortages multiplied German weaknesses. By autumn 1944, Weber had become something approaching obsessed with fuel consumption calculations. He maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking German fuel allocations compared to estimated American fuel deliveries. He analyzed after-action reports specifically for information about fuel constraints affecting operations. He corresponded with logistics officers in field commands, collecting first-hand accounts of how fuel shortages limited tactical options. The picture that emerged was devastating in its implications. German armored forces were gradually being immobilized not by combat losses, but by simple lack of fuel. Tanks sat in rear areas awaiting fuel deliveries that never came, or came in quantities insufficient for operations. Panzer divisions reported operational readiness rates below 40%, not because 40% of their tanks were damaged, but because 60% lacked fuel for movement. American bombing of synthetic fuel plants beginning in May 1944 accelerated this crisis into catastrophe. Germany had always relied heavily on synthetic fuel production through the Fischer-Tropsch process, converting coal into gasoline and diesel through expensive and energy-intensive industrial methods. The synthetic fuel plants were large, fixed installations, vulnerable to air attack. When Allied bombers began systematically targeting these facilities, German fuel production collapsed. By September 1944, synthetic fuel output had dropped approximately 75% compared to pre-bombing levels. The Luftwaffe received priority for remaining fuel stocks, leaving ground forces with steadily decreasing allocations. Panzer divisions that had operated under fuel constraints for months now faced genuine fuel starvation. Some units reported receiving enough fuel for perhaps 30 to 50 kilometers of movement per week, barely sufficient to reposition within defensive sectors, completely inadequate for offensive operations or rapid response to enemy breakthroughs. Weber calculated that American armored divisions in France during this same period probably received fuel allocations sufficient for several hundred kilometers of movement weekly, though exact figures were impossible to determine from available intelligence. The disparity was so enormous that precise numbers became almost meaningless. American forces could move. German forces mostly could not. That fundamental difference determined operational outcomes regardless of tactical details. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Ardennes Offensive in December 1944 provided final, definitive proof of how fuel constraints crippled German armoured operations despite tactical skill and operational planning. The offensive represented Germany's last major attack, concentrating scarce resources for one desperate attempt to split Allied armies and potentially force a negotiated settlement. Operational planning acknowledged that German logistics could not supply adequate fuel for sustained operations deep into Allied-controlled territory. The solution proposed by German planners was simultaneously logical, given their constraints, and absolutely indicative of strategic desperation. German armoured formations would capture American fuel dumps during their advance, using enemy supplies to sustain their offensive. Kampfgruppe Paper, the spearhead armoured battle group leading the attack, had specific intelligence about fuel depot locations along their planned route. They would drive hard for these objectives, refuel from captured stocks, and continue advancing before American forces could organize effective resistance. This plan failed utterly. Piper's battle group advanced approximately 60 kilometers in the first 36 hours, achieving remarkable tactical success and creating panic in American rear areas. They approached within 1,000 feet of a major American fuel dump at Stavelot, containing millions of gallons of gasoline, enough to fuel the entire German offensive for days. American engineers, recognizing the danger, set the dump ablaze just before German forces could capture it. Without access to captured fuel, Piper's advance stalled. His tanks consumed their internal fuel reserves. No German supply convoys reached his position through the congested and chaotic rear areas. Within 72 hours of beginning their attack, his battle group sat immobilized by fuel starvation, surrounded by American forces, ultimately forced to abandon all their vehicles and attempt escape on foot. The broader Ardennes offensive followed similar patterns throughout its duration. German units advanced impressively in early stages, then gradually slowed and stopped as fuel ran out. Some units reported abandoning operational tanks simply because they had no fuel to drive them and could not wait for supply convoys that might never arrive. American forces, after recovering from initial surprise, counterattacked with typical American methods. Massive artillery support, consuming ammunition at rates that would bankrupt German logistics. Close air support once weather cleared, flying thousands of sorties daily. And continuous supply deliveries that kept American units mobile and combat effective, while German units slowly starved of fuel, ammunition, and supplies. Weber watched this catastrophe unfold through intelligence reports and operational summaries reaching Berlin. The offensive he had privately predicted would fail due to logistics constraints failed exactly as predicted for exactly those reasons. German tactical skill and operational planning were irrelevant because the fundamental mathematics of fuel supply made sustained offensive operations impossible. He prepared one final report in January 1945, summarizing 3 years of analysis and presenting conclusions he knew would be ignored but felt professionally obligated to document. The Sherman's superior fuel efficiency was not an isolated advantage but representative of fundamental American design. Philosophy that prioritized practical logistics sustainability over impressive technical specifications. German tanks were engineered for maximum combat performance, achieving superior specifications in armor, firepower, and theoretical mobility. But these impressive capabilities could not be sustained in field operations because German logistics could not supply the fuel, spare parts, and maintenance support that high-performance vehicles demanded. American tanks were engineered for practical logistics sustainability, accepting adequate rather than superior combat performance in exchange for reliability and economy that could be supported by field logistics systems. The difference in design philosophy reflected deeper industrial and military culture differences. Germany's engineering tradition emphasized theoretical excellence and precision craftsmanship. Tanks were precision instruments, complex mechanisms requiring skilled operators and constant expert maintenance. America's engineering tradition emphasized practical functionality and mass production. Tanks were tools, designed to be operated by briefly trained crews and maintained by mechanics with ordinary automotive skills. In sustained total war, practical functionality defeated theoretical excellence because wars were won by the side that could keep more tanks running, more of the time-consuming supplies that could actually be delivered to forward units. Weber's final report included calculations that made the implications devastatingly clear. If a Panzer division with 200 tanks, averaging 200-kilometer operational range, required refueling after advancing 150 kilometers, the logistics burden involved approximately 400,000 liters of fuel delivered forward under combat conditions through vulnerable supply routes subject to air attack. If an American armored division with 200 Shermans averaging 600-kilometer range required refueling after advancing 400 kilometers, they still only needed the same 400,000 liters but had covered nearly 3 times the distance. The American division could exploit breakthroughs deeper, could outmaneuver German forces over greater distances, could sustain operations longer before requiring logistical pauses, could choose when and where to stop for resupply, rather than being forced to stop when fuel tanks ran dry. These advantages were multiplicative. Better fuel economy, combined with superior logistics infrastructure, combined with abundant fuel production, created operational capabilities that German forces could not match. German Panzer divisions in 1945 increasingly found themselves relegated to local counterattacks and defensive operations. Not because of losses or lack of tactical skill, but because fuel constraints made operational-level mobile warfare impossible. American armored divisions conducted sweeping operational movements across hundreds of kilometers, enveloping German positions, cutting supply lines, capturing territory faster than German forces could redeploy to defend it. The fuel efficiency advantage that Weber had first identified from that unremarkable technical report in October 1943 had proven to be a strategic factor, as significant as American industrial production superiority or Allied air supremacy. It was not that American tanks were vastly superior in direct combat. German Panthers and Tigers, with their heavier armor and more powerful guns, remained dangerous opponents that Allied tankers respected and feared. The issue was that German supertanks spent most of their time immobilized by fuel shortages, while adequate American tanks continued operating because they could run on the fuel actually available. In the final analysis, a Sherman that reached the battlefield with fuel in its tanks was infinitely more valuable than a Panther that sat immobilized 50 kilometers behind the lines waiting for fuel trucks that never arrived. By March 1945, Weber's analysis had become grimly academic. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine and advancing into Germany from the west. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating. Fuel shortages were so severe that remaining armoured vehicles sometimes received only enough fuel to reach defensive positions, with no reserve for manoeuvring or withdrawal. Weber continued his work with professional discipline even as the regime he served collapsed around him. He compiled final logistics assessments documenting fuel consumption rates, operational ranges, and the cumulative effect of German logistics disadvantages. These reports were filed in orderly fashion, even though no one would read them. No decisions would be based on them. No operations would be affected by them. In early April 1945, Weber received orders to evacuate Berlin as Soviet forces approached. He packed carefully selected documents, including copies of his analyses about American fuel efficiency advantages, and joined the chaotic westward evacuation of government offices. He survived the war's end, was briefly detained by American forces, and eventually returned to civilian life in West Germany. Years later, historians studying German logistics during World War II discovered Weber's reports in captured Wehrmacht archives. His analysis of Sherman fuel efficiency proved remarkably accurate. Post-war American technical data confirmed that Sherman operational range under typical field conditions was indeed approximately 600 kilometers, roughly 3 times the range of German Panther tanks under similar conditions. American logistics officers who reviewed Weber's assessments after the war expressed professional respect for his analytical work, while noting that German high command had apparently ignored his conclusions. The Americans had known their tanks were fuel efficient because they had deliberately designed them that way. They were surprised that German analysts had identified this advantage and quantified its operational implications. Yet German forces continued employing tactics and operational methods that fuel constraints made unsustainable. The Sherman's 600-kilometer operational range resulted from deliberate design decisions that prioritized logistics sustainability as a primary requirement, rather than accepting it as a constraint to be managed. American tank designers in 1940 and 1941 understood that American armored divisions would operate thousands of miles from their industrial base, supplied through maritime logistics chains vulnerable to submarine attack, dependent on complex supply networks that would be strained by competing demands. Tanks that consumed excessive fuel would strain these logistics networks beyond capacity. Tanks that achieved good fuel economy would ease logistics burdens and enable sustained operations. The choice was straightforward: design for fuel efficiency or accept operational limitations that enemy logistics constraints might not impose on enemy forces. The Continental R975 engine selected for early Sherman variants was not the most powerful engine available. It was not the most advanced engine American industry could produce. It was a reliable, proven design adapted from aircraft use, known for consistent performance and reasonable fuel economy. The engine produced adequate power for combat requirements, approximately 350 horsepower, moving a 30-ton tank at acceptable speeds across varied terrain. German designers, selecting engines for their tanks, prioritized maximum power output, accepting higher fuel consumption as the necessary cost of superior performance. The Maybach HL 230 engine in the Panther produced 700 horsepower, twice the Sherman's output, enabling impressive acceleration and high top speed. This engine consumed approximately 2.5 litres of fuel per kilometer under typical operating conditions, more than double the Sherman's consumption rate. The Panther's powerful engine made it faster and more agile than the Sherman in direct comparison. But the Panther's fuel consumption meant that German logistics had to deliver more than twice as much fuel per kilometer of movement. When German logistics systems struggled to deliver adequate fuel supplies, the high-performance engine became a liability rather than an advantage. The tank's theoretical performance capabilities exceeded what could be sustained in practice. American designers made conscious trade-offs, accepting adequate performance that could be sustained logistically rather than pursuing maximum performance that would be unsustainable. This philosophy extended throughout the Sherman's design. The transmission used synchronizers that reduced fuel consumption during gear changes. The final drive ratios balanced performance with economy. The air filtration system was designed for reliability rather than minimum restriction. Every system prioritized sustained operability over peak performance. The result was a tank that would never win specifications, comparison with German Panthers or Tigers, but would keep running day after day under conditions that left German tanks immobilized. In sustained campaigns, consistency mattered more than peak capability. The tank that operated at 80% efficiency for 30 days was more valuable than the tank that operated at 95% efficiency for 10 days, then sat broken for 20 days awaiting repair or refueling. German post-war analysis, conducted by former Wehrmacht officers working for American intelligence services, acknowledged that fuel efficiency had been a significant operational disadvantage that German planners failed to adequately address. General der Panzertruppe Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as Chief of Staff for various panzer armies, wrote in his post-war memoir that German tanks were technically superior to American tanks in most specifications, but that American logistics advantages more than compensated for technical inferiority. He specifically noted that American tanks required less maintenance, consumed less fuel, and could be kept operational at higher rates than German vehicles. These factors, combined with American industrial capacity and logistics infrastructure, made American armored forces more operationally effective despite German advantages in individual tank capabilities. Mellenthin's assessment reflected recognition by professional German officers that they had lost not because of combat performance, but because of logistics sustainability. German tanks could win tactical engagements, but could not sustain operational campaigns. American tanks might lose more frequently in direct combat, but their forces maintained offensive pressure continuously because their vehicles kept running. The fuel efficiency disparity also affected tactical employment in ways that German commanders struggled to address. Panzer divisions operating under severe fuel constraints had to minimize unnecessary movement, carefully calculating whether each tactical repositioning justified the fuel expenditure. This defensive mindset contradicted fundamental armored warfare principles, emphasizing mobility and offensive action. American armored divisions operated without similar fuel anxieties. Units repositioned frequently between sectors, concentrated rapidly for attacks, dispersed to avoid counterattacks, conducted reconnaissance in force to locate enemy positions, pursued defeated enemy units to prevent their escape. This operational tempo exhausted crews but proved devastatingly effective at keeping German forces off balance and unable to establish stable defensive positions. The Americans could afford aggressive mobile tactics because their tanks consumed less fuel per kilometer, and their logistics delivered fuel abundantly. German forces had to adopt more conservative operational methods, not from doctrine or preference, but from necessity imposed by fuel constraints. By 1945, the cumulative effect of these advantages had become visible in operational outcomes across all theatres. In Western Europe, after the Normandy breakout, American armoured divisions conducted pursuit operations covering hundreds of kilometres in weeks, capturing territory faster than German forces could retreat or establish new defensive lines. German counterattacks consistently failed not from lack of tactical skill, but from insufficient fuel to sustain operations beyond initial gains. In Italy, American armoured forces maintained steady pressure through difficult terrain that favoured defenders, advancing methodically because they could sustain operations indefinitely while German forces had to carefully ration fuel and choose when to commit their limited mobile reserves. On the Eastern Front, German Panzer divisions that had once conducted brilliant mobile operations found themselves increasingly tied to fixed positions, unable to respond flexibly to Soviet attacks because moving tanks consumed fuel that might be needed for desperate defensive battles. The Sherman's operational range advantage, first identified by Major Weber in that October 1943 technical report, had proven to be a strategic factor that shaped operational outcomes as decisively as any battlefield engagement. It was not a wonder weapon or revolutionary technology. It was simply competent automotive engineering, applied systematically to military vehicle design, prioritizing sustainable operations over impressive specifications. German engineering culture, emphasizing precision and theoretical excellence, had produced tanks with superior combat specifications that could not be supported logistically in sustained campaigns. American engineering culture, emphasizing practical functionality and mass production, produced tanks with adequate combat capability that could be sustained operationally for extended periods. In total war lasting years rather than weeks, sustainability determined victory more surely than technical superiority. The lesson took decades to fully recognize. Post-war German tank design philosophy shifted dramatically, incorporating American emphasis on reliability and operational sustainability. The Leopard 1 main battle tank, developed by West Germany in the 1950s and 60s, consciously prioritized mechanical reliability and ease of maintenance over maximum combat specifications. German engineers had learned through bitter experience that theoretical performance advantages meant nothing if vehicles could not be kept operational in field conditions. The Sherman's 600-kilometer operational range represented American industrial maturity and engineering pragmatism applied to military requirements. It was not accidental or fortunate. It resulted from deliberate design decisions by engineers who understood that logistics sustainability determined operational effectiveness in modern war. German analysts recognized this advantage by late 1943 through systematic technical evaluation. They quantified the operational implications through careful calculation. They warned that American fuel efficiency multiplied American logistics advantages in ways that German forces could not counter. Their warnings were ignored or dismissed because accepting them meant acknowledging that German tactical excellence could not overcome fundamental logistics disadvantages. The mathematical proof existed in captured technical reports, showing Sherman fuel consumption rates half those of German tanks. It existed in operational analyses, showing American armored divisions advancing 3 times farther between refueling stops. It existed in field reports documenting German operations increasingly constrained by fuel shortages while American operations continued unabated. The proof was comprehensive, verified from multiple sources, and systematically ignored by leadership, unwilling to accept implications that contradicted cherished beliefs about German technical superiority. Major Klaus Weber's analysis proved prophetic. The Sherman's fuel efficiency advantage, combined with American logistics superiority and abundant fuel production, enabled operational capabilities that German Panzer divisions could not match. German tanks might win individual engagements through superior armor and firepower, but American tanks won campaigns through sustained operations that German forces could not maintain. In the final accounting, victory went not to the side with the most impressive specifications, but to the side that could keep more tanks running more of the time-consuming supplies that could actually be delivered. The Sherman achieved this through unglamorous engineering decisions prioritizing fuel economy and reliability over maximum performance. These decisions, barely noticed in individual tank specifications, proved strategically decisive when multiplied across thousands of vehicles operating over years of sustained combat. The 600-kilometer operational range stunned German logistics officers because it represented capabilities they had not believed possible and operational advantages they had no means to counter. Once identified, the advantage should have prompted fundamental reassessment of German tank design priorities and operational planning. Instead, it was noted, calculated, documented, filed, and ignored, while German armoured forces gradually immobilized themselves through fuel starvation that superior German engineering could neither prevent nor overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.